The lost city of Atlantis. Where is it? Modern archaeologists have guesses that range everywhere from the Azores to southern Spain to the North Sea. But nobody's found it yet. Or have we? Welcome to the in-between. I'm Carol Ann. If you haven't already seen our Atlantis overview video, there's a link in the description below. But today, we're bringing you something different. Because Atlantis, well, it may have been found. A group of ancient explorers, more than happy to take on a small exploration expedition before they have to get back on their boat again, choose the obvious path in front of them, a wide, flat plain seemingly carved out from the higher plains rising on each side. As they trek on, their feet continually crunching on seashells, they see remnants of a civilization at numerous spots along their journey in the form of rock drawings. The drawings show tools and weapons and boats and even chariots. Lots of chariots. As they walk even further, they see what's now known as Ben Amira, a huge monolithic rock standing alone in the flat, sandy plain. They climb the rock to get a better look at the surrounding landscape. Off in the distance, they see yet another small rise. So they climb down the rock and head over to the next rise, the Adrar Plateau. And after some time walking along the ridge, they see it. Laid out before them are the remnants of a huge abandoned city that to our explorers had to have been a place of great power and wonder and riches. This must have been the home to all of the boats and weapons and chariots that they saw drawn on the rocks they'd passed on the way here. This must have been Atlantis. Who made this incredible discovery? Well, we don't know. We know someone did, but we have several candidates. And to understand the potential of this location, we have to backtrack a little so we can get the whole story in the proper context. So let's go back, and get a look at the first literal picture, the maps. Now, there's a few things we need to understand about what people thought the world was when they made the first maps. At first, there were just two islands, Europe and Asia. Back then, people only knew that there were two types of land. One was green and cold, that was Europe, and the other was hot, that was Asia. But then they're like, well, wait a minute, all of Asia is hot, but there's kind of a difference between the East and the West. Notice I said they were islands. That's because back then, anytime you needed to cross any amount of water to get to the other land, that land was considered an island, or in Greek, Nessos. It didn't have to be surrounded by water. You just had to cross some body of water to get there, even a river. So they noticed that the Nile River actually broke up Asia into two islands. So they named the new island Libya. Up to that point, nobody had ventured very far into Libya, so that's where the map stops. So now there are three islands. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the Okeanos, or the ocean, was like the ocean. It was the huge body of water that was thought to be more like a huge river that surrounded everything, and the land was a big circle in the middle of it. So all lakes and rivers come from the Okeanos. And that means that when you hear that the location of Atlantis was past the Atlantic Sea, it does not mean the Atlantic Ocean. Their use of the term sea could just as easily mean a lake. But our first stop goes back even further than these maps. We're going to start out way back, like 20,000 years back. At that time, there was a tribe of people living in the mountain country just a bit inland from the north coast of Africa. Now, science referred to them as Ibero-Maurusians, but in ancient times, they were known as Atlanteans. In fact, the mountain range that they were known to inhabit is, to this day, known as the Atlas Mountains. And that whole area, basically anything that wasn't the area that is now Egypt and Libya, was known as Atlantia or Atlantis, the kingdom of the descendants of Atlas, also known as the Atlanteans. For reasons not quite clear, those mountain-dwelling Atlanteans started moving east around 8700 BC. Took them about 700 years, but they managed to make their way all the way across the northern coast of Africa until they got to Egypt. Most historians will tell you that the first civilizations in Egypt started around 3100 BC, but that's not quite true. There were several tribes in the area way before that. But when the Atlanteans arrive, they come face to face with probably either the Khadans or the Harifians. Whoever it was not a happy encounter for the current inhabitants. Probably one of the first wars in human history. The Atlanteans were a different breed of human, so to speak, with noticeably bigger and different skulls. And they were said to be advanced people, which probably means that they had advanced weaponry. All we really know is that both of these cultures, the Harifians and the Khadans, both died out around that same time that the Atlanteans hit the scene. And how do we know this? Well, both archaeological evidence and because those who lived kept records. But hold that thought for a bit because our timeline takes a bit of a jump right here. Fast forward to 600 BC, and King Necho II, king of Egypt, was a little ticked off, and he's been that way for 5 years. Because 5 years before that, he and his army were trounced by King Nebuchadnezzar II and his Babylonian army, causing Necho II to lose all of his lands east of the Red Sea. Not so good for the ego. So he's just itching to find some place that he can conquer to make up for it. So he has two choices, south or west. Now, he pretty much knew what to expect if he went south, but he has no idea what lays to the west. So before sending his armies in that direction, he decides a little reconnaissance mission might be in order. Let's figure out A, if there's anything worth conquering, and or B, if we attack, can we win? And instead of sending his own people, he manages to talk some Phoenicians who are great sailors into sailing around Libya, or Africa as we know it today, and checking out that west side to see if there's anything worth sending an army for. Now remember, they didn't think there was too much beyond what they already knew to be out there. So they didn't think that sailing around to the west side of the island from the south would really take that long. In fact, what he really wanted them to find was a river that would give them a shortcut to the west side without having to go around the entire island. And since they didn't have the huge galleon ships like the explorers of the 16th century had that could hold a lot of supplies, the Phoenicians would sail for a while, stop, plant seeds, and while they're waiting for harvest time, have a look around and explore wherever they are at the time. Pretty unique way to explore. Once they can harvest what they've planted, they load up the ships and head on down the coast, which means it took them 3 years to get it all the way around. And one of the last stops they made before sailing their way back east through the Strait of Gibraltar and back home was the Bay of Arguin. Could these have been the guys who walked up the dry riverbed? They absolutely could have been. Once they stop and plant their seeds, they have months to look around and explore the region before it's harvest time. Did they? I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure, but we do know that after that trip, the maps were updated to include a 4th island continent of Atlantia. And just a few years after the Phoenician explorers sail home, a guy named Solon takes a trip from Athens to Egypt. Solon is well known as one of the 7 wise men of Greece, and he's actually credited as the man who laid the foundations for democracy in Greece. I love this guy. Athens was having issues under their current system, so they hand over the power to reform their laws to Solon. Then Solon makes a bunch of changes, and being a man of true integrity, hands the power back to the people. He then takes off, traveling for 10 years so that no one can persuade him to change the new laws back. And one of the places that he visits is Egypt. By this time, civilization in Egypt is pretty well established. Solon spends some time hanging out with the current pharaoh of Egypt at the time, Amasis II, and learning and debating with some of the priests in their temples. He's chatting with the priest at the temple of Sais one day about the long, storied past of Greece, dating all the way back to 1500 BC. When the priest says to him,
"O Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you."
Solon asks him, "What do you mean?"
"I mean to say that in mind, you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you why."
So the priest explains to Solon that the Grecians can only go back in their history to 1500 BC for a good reason. Because right around then, the volcano on the island of Thera, or modern-day Santorini, erupted. And I mean erupted. On the Volcanic Explosivity Index, Mount St. Helens was about a 4.5. This was between a 6 and a 7, and the scale only goes up to 7. So it pretty much wipes out the island of Crete and sends a 30-foot tsunami through the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, taking a lot of people and Greek history with it. The priest goes on to explain by literally reading the writing on the walls, as the walls of the temple are covered in hieroglyphics documenting their history, that the world has had countless deluges and earthquakes, and many civilizations have come and gone. Unfortunately, we can't look at those walls today because the temple at Sais was claimed by the Nile River.
They sank into the swamp, so...
He then gives Solon a quick rundown on their much longer history, including the battle with the Atlantean people who defeated Egypt in that time and colonized the area. Many of the Atlanteans settled there and told stories of their past and of their once great capital city, Atlantis, which was destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, reclaimed by the sea and leaving only an impassable, muddy plain with just a few reeds reaching out of the water. Eventually, Solon returns home and tells everyone about his 10 years of adventure, including his conversation with the Egyptian priest. Over time and oral tradition, the story eventually makes its way to Plato. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. A few years after Solon's visit to Egypt, Hanno the explorer from Carthage decides to sow some exploration oats. So he sets out to explore from Carthage in the Mediterranean down the western side of the island. He wrote all about his trip in the Periplus of Hanno. A periplus is basically just an ancient journal explorers used to keep track of navigation and discoveries and any people they ran into, and even future trading opportunities that they might have. So they sail past the Strait of Gibraltar and down the coastline. One of their first stops is at the Lixus River, which is now the Leucos River, located at the modern city of Larache. They met the Lexitas people and hang out with them for a while. The Lexitas tell Hanno of these men who lived above them in the mountains,
dwelling in a land full of wild beasts and shut off by great mountains, from which they say the Lixus flows, and on the mountains live men of various shapes, cave dwellers, who, so the Lixita say, are fleeter of foot than horses.
So that tells us that as of roughly 500 BC, there are still some people living up in the Atlas Mountains that didn't look like the rest of the people around them. Sometime in the following 100 years, a Greek historian called Hellanicus writes his version of world history that includes a mention of Atlantis, as does Diodorus Siculus in his Library of history around roughly 50 BC. And right in between those two guys, around 360 BC, we get the books known as Critias and Timaeus from none other than Plato, whose description of Atlantis passed down through oral tradition, through multiple generations, starting from his ancestor Solon, who got it straight from the Egyptian priest, is by far the most famous. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was a large island located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or the Strait of Gibraltar. It was ruled by a powerful kingdom with an advanced civilization and technology. The Atlanteans lived in a utopian society with magnificent palaces, temples, and infrastructure. However, Plato described how the Atlanteans became greedy and imperialistic. About 9,000 years before Solon's time, they conquered and enslaved much of Africa. They were eventually defeated by the Aegeans, who were the ancient ancestors of the Athenians, in a great war. But even though the Atlanteans lost the war, the gods are still displeased by their hubris and corruption. So in a single cataclysmic day and night, Atlantis is destroyed by earthquakes, floods, and is swallowed up by the sea, lost beneath the waters. Only an impassable muddy shoal remains where the great city once stood. Now, most of us have heard at least this rough description of Atlantis from Plato before, but many don't believe it because they say the whole story is just a made-up tale, an allegory to teach the consequences of bad government on top of bad morals. However, throughout all the rest of Plato's works, he actually goes through the trouble of pointing out which ones are stories or allegories, fictitious narratives to prove a point. But he does not do that for either Critias or Timaeus. In fact, he goes out of his way in numerous points to say that Atlantis was a real place and that this is real history passed on from his ancestor, the great Solon. If these were indeed fables, why would he go out of his way to say otherwise, not call them out like all the others? And while we're in the depths of ancient Greek philosophers, let's dispel another common myth, the mistaken idea that Aristotle said the quiet part out loud, that Atlantis was a fictional creation of Plato. He actually said no such thing. In fact, up until the 19th century, no one had the idea that Aristotle didn't believe that Atlantis was real. Not until a French astronomer named Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre made a grave error in the early 1800s. See if you can track with me on this. In reading a commentary work written in Latin in 1587 by a French scholar named Isaac Casaubon, which was about the work of Greek geographer Strabo, written around the year 0, which was talking about a comment made by a Greek historian, Posidonius, written about 50 BC, that mentions Atlantis, he made a mistake in his translation, which ended up tying together two completely unrelated passages. I couldn't make that up if I tried. That whole story is a video for another channel, but suffice to say that ever since then, people have taken it as gospel that Aristotle didn't believe Atlantis was real. But he did. So if we proceed with the idea that Plato's story is a true telling of history, then let's take a closer look at exactly what he said, because as they say, the devil is in the details. Between both of his works, Critias and Timaeus, but especially Critias, Plato puts forth several details about the city of Atlantis.
Making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water. And beginning from the sea they bored a canal, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbour. And the stone they quarried beneath the central island all round, and from beneath the outer and inner circles, some of it being white, some black, and some red. Surrounding the city was a level plain, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across the centre, inland, it was 2,000 stadia. This part of the island looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north. Rivers and lakes and meadows supplying food enough for every animal, wild or tame. The surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond any which still exist.
At this point, I know some of you know exactly where we are going with this. But for those of you who don't, welcome to the Eye of the Sahara, also known as the Eye of Africa, or technically known as the Richat Structure. Now, a lot of this information comes from the work of Jimmy Corsetti at Bright Insight, and Cris Tolworthy from Pythagoras was right. So big thank yous to both of them. Links to their channels and to their websites are in the description below. Definitely go check those out. So, what is the Richat Structure? The Richat Structure is a roughly 100 million year old geological rock formation, presumably the remnants of a collapsed volcanic dome, smack dab in the middle of the Sahara Desert in what is now the country of Mauritania. I know, seems like an odd location for Atlantis, but this place ticks a ton of Atlantean detail boxes. It didn't get any attention from modern geologists until about the 1930s and 40s. And because of how big it is from side to side, we didn't get our first really good look at the whole of the structure until satellite imagery taken in the 1960s. And I know it doesn't really look like much today, but imagine what it may have been like, let's say 20,000 years ago. 100 million years of geological machinations would have built up the soil on top of the structure. And I do mean soil. There's plenty of evidence of this area alternating between lush and green and the desert that it is today. So there's plenty of organic material for soil back then. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that Africa used to have a vast network of lakes and rivers, which would have made any migration or expansion pretty easy. We now know there was once a huge river in this very same area called the Tamanrasset that was flowing up until about 5,000 years ago, the same time that the whole area dried up. It was big, so it would have had tributaries coming from all over. There was also Mega Lake Chad that connected surrounding area rivers. So, with all of this water flowing in seemingly every direction, to think that there could have been a river system that connected the Richat to the ocean is not crazy at all. In fact, many people of the era thought that the Nile curved west and came out on the other side of the island. That's what Nico II sent the Phoenicians to find. That dissecting river stays on maps for a long time. We know now that it's not quite how things are laid out, but it does go to show that Africa once had long rivers that went deep into the interior of the continent. So let's say that you're a wandering Atlantean and you're crossing this flat area that is now known as the Adrar Plateau, which translates to Little Atlas. And you make it to the other side, only to look out and see some lush, green, hilly territory with valleys filled with water from connected streams and rivers, all laid out right in front of you. And once you explore the area a little more, you realize that those hills and valleys form circles. What a great place to build a fortified city. Seems like a no-brainer. People have been taking advantage of pre-existing geologic structures since the beginning of time. Okay, so now we have a civilization living on the structure. How on earth do we connect that to Plato's description of Atlantis? Well, let's go through what he said. Plato mentions that the full diameter of Atlantis is 127 stadia. One stadia is 607 feet. So 127 stadia equals 77,089 feet, or about 14 and a half miles, or about 23 kilometers. Now, I get that my Google Earth measurements aren't that exact, but this is pretty darn close. He mentions mountains to the north that had rivers flowing down. He mentions a wide plain. The rings are there. The opening to the south for ships coming in and out is there. The red, white, and black stones are all over the place. Our second video on this is already in the works, matching the geological and geographical tie-ins much more in depth. So I won't go too deep on the physical attributes here. Just keep your eyes open for that second video. Instead, let's go back to some of the things we just learned about the history of the area and see how all of that, plus Plato's descriptions, fits the possibility that the Eye of the Sahara is the lost city of Atlantis. Okay, let's tackle the idea that Atlantis was an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The name certainly tells us that we're heading in the right direction. So if you're leaving from Greece, you first need to sail across the Mediterranean Sea to the place where the sea meets the Atlantic. That place is the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato said,
"There was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles."
Now, the Pillars of Heracles are the Greek version of the Pillars of Hercules. Same thing. They're both just names of the two mountains on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar, where it's claimed that Hercules used his might to push the African and European continents apart between the two mountains. But what does he mean by in front of the straits? Well, back then, that huge expanse in front of you that is the Atlantic Ocean was nothing but certain death. So they just didn't go out there. Instead, they always stuck close to whatever coastline they were sailing. So when you look at the strait, the path in front of you would be the northern coastal sea of Africa, which was called Atlanticum Mare, or the Sea of Atlas. Therefore, the path to Atlantis was along the coast of Africa and past the Atlas Mountains. Once you get out past the strait, the Gulf and Canary currents pick you right up and pull you along the coast of Africa, which eventually leads you down to the Bay of Arguin, the closest open water spot to the Richat Structure. One more reason that Atlantis is most likely not an island as we imagine, out in the middle of the ocean, is that Plato said,
"Harbors were full of vessels and merchants coming from all parts, night and day."
Well, that implies a central location, not the middle of an ocean. There were not hundreds of ships sailing into the middle of the ocean on a regular basis to trade. It's just not how it worked back then. Which means it also has to be a place big enough for a large population if it's busy all day and all night. And for those of you keeping track of other possible locations, that rules out the Azores. And I know it's hard to wrap your head around the idea that an island could be in the middle of a continent. But again, back then, island just meant a place that you had to cross water to get to. The type and size of the water didn't matter. River, lake, it all meant the same thing. And in those days, there were lots of rivers flowing that could have been in the path of people traveling over from east to west. Literally, whole continents were referred to as islands. And I have to take one last shot at the island in the middle of the ocean theory. Elephants. Plato said,
"There were a great number of elephants in the island."
Here's the Siren's vase from 5th century BC, depicting the type of boats that they had then. Now, by the time they got to Plato in the 4th century, they had something called a trireme, which is much bigger. But even then, I still can't imagine boats from 8,000 years before that were anywhere near big enough to hold an elephant for an extended amount of time while they sailed the Atlantic Ocean. The area around the Eye of the Sahara, on the other hand, is full of rock art depictions of elephants. Elephant bones are still around, and elephants still live all over southwestern and southern Africa. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have been in the northern regions back when it was lush and green 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. Another feature of Atlantis was its abundance of gold. Plato describes statues of gold, gold throughout the temples, and walls of gold around that. Gold everywhere. Wow. Ancient Mauritania, which includes the Richat Structure, was known for having lots of gold. They're the ones who supplied Europe with gold before the discovery of America. The Mali Empire king Mansa Musa, who ruled a region including Mauritania in the 14th century, was the richest man in history, owning more than half the world's gold. And what is one of Mauritania's main industries and exports today? Gold. One of the rings of land, Plato says,
a race course of a stadium in width and in length allowed to extend all round the island for horses to race in.
Sounds kind of funny to think of horse races before 9000 BC, but around that whole area, there are over 1,200 different locations of rock art depicting chariots. Lots and lots of chariots. Not to mention weapons and shields and a whole lot of boats. Plato also mentioned that Egypt was a colony of Atlantis. And since we know those Atlanteans, or Ibero-Maurusians, came out of the Atlas Mountains and moved east until they clashed with and defeated either the Khadans or the Harifians, whichever one was there at the time. So making that area a colony after that is totally plausible. And our last reference, for now, to Plato's Critias, talks about what happened after whatever happened to Atlantis. Plato says it
became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the sea.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, we can take this in two different ways. First, if there was a huge flood of some kind that wiped out the city, that whole level plain would, for a time, become a big mud plain. Can't sail down any rivers in that. Or if that flood wiped the city out to the sea to the west and dumped all of the debris when it reached the ocean, there should be a mud pit there. And there is. If there was a deluge of water from whatever source, based on the current topography of Africa, the water would have drained to the west. And we can see on old maps the existence of a mud shoal. And considering when they sailed at the time they hugged the coast, that might seem like an impassable barrier of mud. And I also just want to talk a little bit about the idea that the Atlanteans were a technologically advanced civilization. Plato doesn't go into detail about that, but based on his writing, that is something that has been inferred. And we in these modern times have often interpreted that to mean that they must have had crystal energy and advanced construction and transportation. But that's our idea, not what's written. Sure, they were super rich, militarily strong, and seemingly wise beyond their peers, but to be an advanced civilization only really takes being a little bit more advanced than the next guy. Now, is the only historical evidence we have for the existence of Atlanteans and of the Eye of the Sahara being a possible hub of activity only from written accounts and stories? Nope. We have plenty of ancient maps that show us as well. Let's go all the way back to Herodotus. Remember him, father of history? Maps made from his writings of what the world looked like then clearly show the Atlantis region or kingdom. Now keep in mind that Atlantis was known to be the capital city of the Atlantis or Atlantes kingdom. Kind of like New York City in the state of New York.
New York City!
We also have the map drawn up by Pomponius Mela in roughly 40 AD called the Habitable World of Pomponius Mela. that also shows an area of the western portion of the Sahara as the area of the Atlantis, in the same geographical area where the Richat structure sits. We also have numerous maps that show a region right around where the Richat would be as a big body of water connected to either the oceans or other great rivers, which would make them a trade hub. Side note, I want to know what this guy is all about. Or maybe I don't. On top of that, we have maps that seem to actually show the structure. This map from 1743 was created by European slave traders marking the spots in Africa where they can get more slaves. It's known as the Kirby map because of its mention of a particular village right around where the Richat is located called Ibero-Maurusians Pagus. That's Latin for Kirby Moorish village. Moorish just means from Mauritania. Kirby is Latin for spiral shape. Okay, so let's step back for a second and go over what we have so far. We have a naturally occurring structure that makes a perfect fortified city with water and rivers. We have ancient maps placing a group of people living in the area who most likely stumbled upon it at some point. We have anthropologic proof that these people migrated east and met up with the people in early Egypt and subjugated them. We have the stories of those settlers of their past written out in hieroglyphics. We have people from another area bringing those stories back home and writing them down. We have one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived making those stories public through his wide educational reach. And we have independent evidence that corroborates both the details of the story and the overall context in which the story was written. Convinced yet? Some of you might be, but I'm sure others of you are not. But that's okay. We're not done yet, because we have a whole other video that goes into the more geographical and geological arguments as well. When that video is available, you'll see it right here. And if you want to go back and watch our first video on Atlantis that's more of an overview of the lore of the subject, you can click right here. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on The In-Between.